The princess looked at Koznishev without replying. But the fact that Sergei Ivanovich and the princess seemed anxious to get rid of him did not in the least disconcert Stepan Arkadyevitch. Smiling, he stared at the feather in the princess's hat, and then about him as though he were going to pick something up. Seeing a lady approaching with a collecting box, he beckoned her up and put in a 5-ruble note. "I can never see these collecting boxes unmoved while I've money in my pocket," he said. "And how about today's telegram?" "Fine chaps those Montenegrins." "You don't say so," he cried, when the princess told him that Vronsky was going by this train. For an instant Stepan Arkadyevitch's face looked sad, but a minute later, when, stroking his mustaches and swinging as he walked, he went into the hall where Vronsky was, he had completely forgotten his own despairing sobs over his sister's corpse, and he saw in Vronsky only a hero and an old friend. "With all his faults one can't refuse to do him justice," said the princess to Sergei Ivanovich as soon as Stepan Arkadyevitch had left them. "What a typically Russian, Slav nature." "Only, I'm afraid it won't be pleasant for Vronsky to see him." "Say what you will, I'm touched by that man's fate." "Do talk to him a little on the way," said the princess. "Yes, perhaps, if it happens so." "I never liked him. But this atones for a great deal. He's not merely going himself, he's taking a squadron at his own expense." "Yes, so I heard." A bell sounded. Everyone crowded to the doors. "Here he is," said the princess, indicating Vronsky, who with his mother on his arm walked by, wearing a long overcoat and wide-brimmed black hat. Oblonsky was walking beside him, talking eagerly of something. Vronsky was frowning and looking straight before him, as though he did not hear what Stepan Arkadyevitch was saying. Probably on Oblonsky's pointing them out, he looked round in the direction where the princess and Sergei Ivanovich were standing, and without speaking lifted his hat. His face, aged and worn by suffering, looked stony. Going onto the platform, Vronsky left his mother and disappeared into a compartment. On the platform there rang out "God Save the Tsar," then shouts of hurrah! And _Jivio. One of the volunteers, a tall, very young man with a hollow chest, was particularly conspicuous, bowing and waving his felt hat and a nosegay over his head. Then two officers emerged, bowing too, and a stout man with a big beard, wearing a greasy forage cap. Chapter 3. Saying goodbye to the princess, Sergei Ivanovich was joined by Katavasov. Together they got into a carriage full to overflowing, and the train started. At Tsaritsino station the train was met by a chorus of young men singing. Hail to thee! Again the volunteers bowed and poked their heads out, but Sergei Ivanovich paid no attention to them. He had had so much to do with the volunteers that the type was familiar to him and did not interest him. Katavasov, whose scientific work had prevented his having a chance of observing them hitherto, was very much interested in them and questioned Sergei Ivanovich. Sergei Ivanovich advised him to go into the second class and talk to them himself. At the next station Katavasov acted on this suggestion. At the first stop he moved into the second class and made the acquaintance of the volunteers. They were sitting in a corner of the carriage, talking loudly and obviously aware that the attention of the passengers and Katavasov as he got in was concentrated upon them. More loudly than all talked the tall, hollow-chested young man. He was unmistakably tipsy, and was relating some story that had occurred at his school. Facing him sat a middle-aged officer in the Austrian military jacket of the Guards uniform. He was listening with a smile to the hollow-chested youth, and occasionally pulling him up. The third, in an artillery uniform, was sitting on a box beside them. A fourth was asleep. Entering into conversation with the youth, Katavasov learned that he was a wealthy Moscow merchant who had run through a large fortune before he was 22. Katavasov did not like him, because he was unmanly and effeminate and sickly. He was obviously convinced, especially now after drinking, that he was performing a heroic action, and he bragged of it in the most unpleasant way. The second, the retired officer, made an unpleasant impression too upon Katavasov. He was, it seemed, a man who had tried everything. He had been on a railway, had been a land steward, and had started factories, and he talked, quite without necessity, of all he had done, and used learned expressions quite inappropriately. The third, the artilleryman, on the contrary, struck Katavasov very favorably. He was a quiet, modest fellow, unmistakably impressed by the knowledge of the officer and the heroic self-sacrifice of the merchant, and saying nothing about himself. When Katavasov asked him what had impelled him to go to Servia, he answered modestly, "Oh, well, everyone's going. The Servians want help, too. I'm sorry for them." "Yes, you artillerymen especially are scarce there," said Katavasov. "Oh, I wasn't long in the artillery, maybe they'll put me into the infantry or the cavalry." "Into the infantry when they need artillery more than anything?" said Katavasov, fancying from the artilleryman's apparent age that he must have reached a fairly high grade. "I wasn't long in the artillery, I'm a cadet retired," he said, and he began to explain how he had failed in his examination. All of this together made a disagreeable impression on Katavasov, and when the volunteers got out at a station for a drink, Katavasov would have liked to compare his unfavorable impression in conversation with someone. There was an old man in the carriage, wearing a military overcoat, who had been listening all the while to Katavasov's conversation with the volunteers. When they were left alone, Katavasov addressed him.